Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Hope you can hear me. I'm Jack Chew. This is Chewing It Over. If you're new around here, we come live 12:30 to 1 o'clock on weekdays. However, various things have happened that have made me a lot more tardy on it. That is going to change. I think we're going to maybe mix it up in terms of what the frequency of this is. Maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe slightly different to that. We'll not have more guest hosts on because you guys have been enjoying the First Steps Takeover, the Leanne Antoine show, which I think it probably needs to start being called that, especially if you notice on the second Tuesday of every month, the world turns purple, and she's been doing a brilliant job on a takeover show, so we might just offer a rebrand there. But one of the things that I do love doing is when I get a chance to jump on and talk about a topic and subject that I'm most passionate about, and this very much is one of them. I absolutely love this subject, and admittedly then it becomes something that I talk about an awful lot, and I make no apologies about it because I think it's important. I do, though, also enjoy the fact that that is something that I get challenged on most as well. You know, it's one of the things that I hear from you about, and you know, much like most important things that I might discuss, I absolutely love the fact that that is something that then feedback is flowing. So I want to get stuck into it, and what that is of course unwarranted variation. I've put unwarranted in little scare quotes, I guess, for this reason, is that that's the bit that gets challenging. I think is who gets to determine what is unwarranted, and where is the line drawn between variation that is good, variation that is a positive thing, that then means that there are things that people can choose and decide upon, the variation that makes us individual and unique practitioners, as well as then having a suite of options for patients to then dine out on, and how much then becomes unwarranted because it's so variable that the inconsistencies become a problem in practice. And that is where I think the heart of this challenge is, when this phrase is bandied about, including by me, one of my massive favorite phrases, almost a cliche from me sometimes. I've tried to wind it in a little bit or explain what I mean by it each time I use it. I think it's something that really end up striking to the heart of what are some of the challenges, as well as exciting opportunities that exist in MSK practice. Like, what would it mean to tighten things up and decrease the unwarranted part of variation? And then what opportunities would knock if we did so? Now, the sort of catalyst for why I'm discussing this today, again, is because there is a really interesting and exciting event coming up in, is it maybe a couple of weeks' time? Yeah, I think it's 2 weeks today, the 17th of November. Don't worry if you can't read that. I'm going to zoom in a second. As part of the Connect Health Change series, they're doing a session on unwarranted variation about productivity, and it's with an absolute who's who, and I'll come to who in a minute. But look at this. This is something you should sign up for, free webinar, and you know, you're going to see who's on it, who's going to be sharing their opinion on it. But it's definitely triggered me to discuss not just the topic, but also this particular framing of the topic, right? How bad is unwarranted variation? What are the latest insights? I'll be giving my opinion, but I won't be in touch with the insights. I'm so looking forward to attending this and learning a lot from these people. But also, look at that bottom one. What more can be done to improve outcomes and tackle lateness, right? It's sort of the heart of a problem in MSK at the moment, not least in primary care. But then if that wasn't tickling your fancy as a topic in and of itself, which it should if you are available or you can pick up on the recording, etc., then do so. But look at this. You've got an absolute who's who on there. I mean, Marwan at the top there, absolutely brilliant therapist and medic, director of clinical delivery now at Connect. Tim Briggs, Andrew Bennett, Fiona Rockwell, James Thompson. I mean, I'll admit that I don't know James and I don't know Freddie. Those two bottom ones, no doubt, brilliant. But fundamentally, those top four would be on any panel would be absolutely brilliant and worth listening to on a variety of topics. Andrew Bennett, big fan of his work, and if anything, it pains me how little I've been able to keep in touch and potentially even contribute to his Best MSK Health project. That is purely because of my capacity being massively thrown. Recently, I'm working on it, but you know, there's just some brilliant work being done there. Every time I hear of what's going on with that project, you know, I'm I'm a disagreeable arsehole sometimes, so there's no doubt bits I could nitpick or contribute with critique on. But just as a general rule, the more I hear from it from people I know and trust and their work that I love, it is just that there is a real positive force going on around that, which is brilliant. So it'll be great to hear some insights and contributions from that project as to how that informs that question that's at the center of it, which is a productivity savior. Is it the productivity savior, right? Because that's the thing that excites some people and spooks some people, right? Is it an inherent good to aspire to decrease variation? In this case, can we identify what is unwarranted and decrease it? Because that will, drive us towards more productivity. I think that's what we're wondering and what this question begs, really. And what do I mean by that? The obvious proposition is that if you decrease the unwarranted variation in MSK clinical practice, so for example, unjustified clinical opinion based on a lack of evidence-based support, and by that, of course, I mean not just the narrow empirical sense of guideline following, but also just the mechanistic assertions that get made with styles of practice, or what low-value clinical treatments, as well as then implications of specifics on diagnostic category. If it's as it has been a wild west in MSK practice, whereby anything you can say will go, and until recently will even be insured. The variation. Let me just caricature it for a second and say, you people who get hold of a sprained wrist. There's those that are assessing it under or let's say a wrist pain. There's those that are assessing it under a clinical reasoning model, that are asking the patient to identify their own functional goals as to what they're trying to get back to, that are assessing and screening it for carpal tunnel syndrome, obscure vascular pathology, as well as other things that might have been related to this incident. In this hypothetical example, I'm just meaning that they're applying a sensible triage, as well as then identifying the patient's goals, what their wants are, what their beliefs are around it, and then aspiring them towards improved function through using both diagnostic testing as well as then whatever indicated treatment is sensible and reasonable based on the mechanism of effect of what is, say, contributing to that problem. And that's where they would be using, say, rehab or any other modality, but driving them towards their goals, right? That's me admitting my bias as to what would be a quick example of what quality care might look like in this particular wrist pain. And then if I go cartoonish other extreme, which exists but fortunately is in the minority, especially in this cartoonish example, is someone is assessing said sore wrist in a different location in the country, or different, wherever it might be around the corner from the practice that I was just describing, that did a good job, in my opinion, a good job. We'll come back to why my opinion might not matter or what have you to some. But they get older, said sore wrist, and instead of doing what I just described, they say, and they start reading their palm, right? They start then assuming and assessing it for, say, whatever they feel is their opinion on why they are experiencing wrist pain is because their chakras aren't well aligned, because their lifeline on their palm is demonstrating some sort of distant trauma. They need to apply some mindfulness practice, as well as then come in for some Reiki. And you can hear that obviously you'd think, well, that's not happening in healthcare. Trust me, it is. But obviously, fortunately, a minority. Now, I'm describing then, of course, a spectrum of which most people lie in the middle of, and hopefully the majority. And I don't make any claims on this particular show as to the how well people are distributed amongst that spectrum. I like the optimistic analysis that most would be towards the thing I said at the start, rather than the bullshit I said at the end there. But unfortunately, there's variation, right? And I'm talking about variation. So unwarranted clinical variation might be across that extreme. You've then got people that might have their own hobby horses with regards to, say, a biomechanical analysis of it. You've got people that would then not be mortified if they were to be lumped in with people that are palm reading. But they would say that said wrist pain is probably, in this instance, a secondary to a contralateral ankle problem that's thrown off the biomechanical kinetic chain, right? Again, you might think that that's a far extreme example. I see plenty of that out there. And that logic being played out. You'd have some people that would then imply, because it's their clinical model, that that is simply a stiffness manifesting that needs to be mobilized or manipulated on a semi-regular basis. You've then got people that would say that, if anything, that's a laxity that is manifesting that therefore needs to be stiffened by injection of, say, prolotherapy or PRP, or some sort of indication, if you're orthopedically minded, that there might be something there based on poor clinical tests or hunches that might need then even surgical opinions, right? So there's just a variety of different opinions that might be applied based on the fact that it's a young industry, it's MSK, and that therefore you've got this, it is not, even though you've got massive variation in most practices, of course, but it's not medicine, which obviously is fraught with variation too, but it's also then not pharmacy, it's not physics, these aren't hard sciences, there's lots of art to the science and science in the art. So there's lots of opinions floshing around, there's lots of styles of practice that are going on, and therefore variation occurs. And with variation, there's some good stuff in there, right? There's some variation that you wouldn't want to lose. And so this is why I've put unwarranted in scare quotes, is because I think we need to approach this subject and this phrase carefully. I think that in years gone by, I think I was guilty, as many were, of implying that that was a given, and implying that that is something that people would understand. They'd understand what the unwarranted was in the variation between us, or that they would understand what the downstream consequences are, in many people's opinion, including mine, of unwarranted variation, and why we might want to mitigate it. And I'm going to come to that in a second. And I think that what's cool is that this event, 2 weeks' time, get signed up if you haven't already, will get stuck into, is it will nod to why unwarranted variation might not be helpful, but it will also then talk about the data and how it's felt that overcoming it and improving upon it will only enhance national MSK outcomes, right? And what are we in this for if it's not for that? If it's not for the public good of improving that, as well as then the public health sequelae that comes from raising standards in MSK care. So that's pretty cool. And why this event is exciting is because I think it's going to then, I don't think they necessarily get stuck in the weeds of the sort of philosophy of how much variation is or isn't, or exactly what we mean by unwarranted. I imagine it will get nodded to. But looking at that panel, there it is again, I don't think you're going to necessarily get people that are just, one-track minded over a sort of clinical purity tests, or that you're going to get people that are sort of saying anything that's outside of my preferred style of practice is unwarranted, because that's the vulnerability to it. I said I'd come back to my opinion on this stuff. I think that's one of the things that I think is fascinating, is there are people, and I'm cautious, I'm always conscious to try and make sure that you guys don't see me as one, although, there's plenty that still do, but, definitely not something that is a position I hold if scrutinized, is that there are people that want to say, this is what I consider clinically excellent practice, including sort of styles of practice, what modalities do or don't meet some individual threshold of what they use or don't use, the diagnostics, say, categorizing, or the styles of reasoning. My practice is what is considered clinically excellent, and anything that's too far away from that, or even at all distant from that, is unwarranted, right? That there's this, and that's that purity test piece, right? And so then, does it matter if some randomized therapist is feeling like that? No, probably not. I mean, it's a shame. It's a bit arrogant, a lot arrogant, but it matters less, especially if they're striving towards excellence and they're somewhere at least hopefully close to the bullseye. But it's when that person is someone of influence in whatever circumstance, be that someone that's high up in policy circles, or someone who's got a social media following and that's a sort of pseudo notoriety as an influencer, like myself even. And then you've got your sort of researchers and people that then also that overlaps naturally with having, say, a notoriety, or as an educator, whatever it might be. If they've got influence, then if they hold the opinion I've just described, where unwarranted is anything that's beyond, anything that's too far away from their opinion, then that's where it gets a bit messy, because you end up in a circumstance where it's defined, it's so ill-defined that unwarranted variation becomes an accusation. It becomes something that then, this is best practice according to me, or according to my tribe, my group. If you don't articulate what that is and why, if you don't justify that opinion in a number of different ways, from the mechanistic evidence, say, distant from physiotherapy, but they say what the mechanism of effect is of interventions being suggested, or why the logic might not support the notion of it being, say, as I mentioned, if someone presents with wrist pain in primary care, why the contralateral ankle trauma, the logic of, say, kinetic chains and say fascial trains that sometimes is implied, just from my example before, if you're not talking about the mechanistic likelihood of that and how that's supported within an evidence-based, even before we get into applied, say, multi-centered RCT type work that can sometimes help us to inform what is or isn't useful for what either pathologies or people within certain treatment windows, patient category windows, then you situation where it becomes not well justified or defined by any given individual or group. And so it then becomes unwarranted according to who, and that the current regulatory framework or lack of, and the lack of, because we're in such a, I would argue, hugely agreeable industry in healthcare, where everyone's doing their best and everyone's trying to help, and therefore there's just a sort of what I've called a cult of kindness sometimes that exists, where people, even with a moderate degree of challenge to that, to other assertions, get massively pushed back upon. Then you end up in this situation where there's a relativism that occurs, where it's like, well, you've got your opinions, I've got mine, both are equally valid, both have got a degree of cherry picking, or they go back to even massively different philosophies that underpin those decisions or those opinions and stuff. And so you end up in a situation where it's like, well, each to their own. And especially in public health, and by that I mean in terms of the system, being that when it comes to tax-funded healthcare, I think it's pretty risky business to have an anything goes based system. Now, I'm not saying we have that completely, and especially because this is embodied through thoughtful and caring clinicians that are often aspiring to be better, means that you've got appropriate self-regulation within individuals and teams that then mean that it's not, you don't get much palm reading going on in the NHS these days. Of course, there's edge cases, unfortunately, I do hear of them. But I think instead you've just got to try to find a way that we can speak in appropriate language, whereby people don't get startled by their practice, some feeling like their practice or their style of practice is being come for, or it didn't make the guidelines, therefore stop doing it. Like a heavy-handed semi-regulatory approach whereby things get outlawed and banned, and that there's almost like a big brother effect for any sort of clinical mentoring becomes then tick boxes of are they or aren't they following a flow chart or pathway or guideline, because then you're losing that patient-centeredness, or you're losing it. No, you're not losing the patient-centeredness as much as you're losing the clinical reasoning that we're trying to champion as being sort of central to good practice, best practice in MSK. And I think that that's where the contention lies. And so to this event that I'm on about, I think that it takes for these sorts of conversations whereby they're bringing the data to bear, not necessarily on a clinical level. I doubt they're going to be talking about wrist pain, for example, are they? Or even going high level as to the sort of philosophy of what we're meaning with when we say unwarranted. But I mean, like, they're bringing some of the data to bear to justify why this is, in their opinion, or they might surprise me and say it isn't a problem. But why is it that, what is the data suggesting that would tell us whether or not this is an issue? And therefore, to correct said issue, what would the rewards be? What would the spoils be? What would we be able to then do as an industry, and how would we better be able to raise standards in the health of society? I think that this sort of conversation needs to be had loud and clear, and needs to be had amongst policy wonks. I mean, that's harsh. Look at these. I mean, it's like these are policy influencers, but also clinicians, and they wear a few different hats, right? But if you think about that conversation being had amongst these, and no doubt other members of the audience that will be able to contribute, other experts that can sort of think deeply about this stuff, that's the thing that kind of gets me excited, right? Is that you do all the thinking and talking you want, but you need to crack on with some action. It's one of the things that sort of pains me about some of the challenges that I've faced with my own capacity, or the things that COVID, whilst it's annoying as a ready-made excuse, but the things that COVID has disrupted in terms of momentum. You think about the fact that, for those that have been following along, we launched MSK Reform as a think tank that was going to agitate on these issues, and still is and will do again. But we launch it in November, and then the pandemic that starts to loom February, March of the next following year. You just end up in this situation where there's some really top thinkers, including those in this panel, that were, and many of them have been able to tick things over. And sometimes the pandemic has disrupted things in terms of digital integration and stuff that could be for the positive, and demonstrated rapid change that otherwise might have felt unlikely. So there are some upsides, but I suppose I'm just saying that there's clinicians having those conversations, and there's almost local pathways and guidance that's improving, and rehab-centric practice of trying to get people better in a fundamental level. There's the grift movement of getting it right first time, to stop the fact that then sometimes it's the third layer of care that then ends up being the right one, because there's almost this over-utilitarian approach to sort of like generic care, and that then there's a net underneath that failed generic care, and then you've got almost like a generic triage model that then sort of medicalizes in MSK terms sometimes, if you've just got people signposting to different disembodied tests that don't necessarily then that you basically your advanced practice clinicians aren't necessarily in touch with their core rehab and treatment skills, where the evidence is pointing, because they've got these newfangled skills of imaging requisition and blood tests and injection therapy, or listing people for surgery. So you've ended up with this diagnostic layer that's sometimes not in touch with its rehab layer, that you don't get it right first time. In fact, best case scenario is you know in some cases you end up getting it right third time, and that's actually because the system's set up that way, through no fault of the individual clinicians necessarily, that are kind of having to work under a quite channeled system that doesn't have support. It's not an integrated model of care. Now that varies on postcode and all sorts of stuff, and that's one for another show. But what I'm describing there is variation. You've got some brilliant best practice templates that exist across the country and across the world, and then you've got less so, right? And as soon as you've got that difference, unwarranted variation transcends individual clinical examples such as the wrist pain thing. It's then you've got unwarranted variation in pathways, unwarranted variation in management styles of those differences. You've got unwarranted variation in staff educational budgets and how they're applied, therefore unwarranted variation in CPD opportunity that then would speak to a good balance of sort of scientific thinking if you aspire to a more, I dare say, empirically minded, guideline-inducing RCT-based reasoning of comparing treatment modalities for certain pathologies. And then you've got, the other side of it is a false dichotomy, really, but the other side of it being that they've got then a movement of people that don't have as much respect, say, or integration of that level of evidence, and therefore want to sort of have a more thoughtful, considered conversation, about subjective variables affecting people's care, and it's sort of patient-centeredness does end up then erring towards the downside of that. If I've said the downside of sort of empiricism of sorts, and then the downside of what is under the guise of person-centeredness ends up being pandering in many ways. The patient is always right type phenomena, whereby their biases and instincts are then assumed to be, because they're so central to them and their needs, that they're not necessarily countered with any veracity. Means that unfortunately that both extremes of that don't work. So again, I'm just defining variety. I'm not necessarily even on those instances giving much of a judgment, because I think you can hear me being irritated by both, I guess. But it's more today for this conversation to be about that variation. And what parts of that variation are useful? What parts of it make it interesting? What parts of it make it a really exciting time to be an MSK? Because there's far fewer hard and fast rules than we used to have. I remember I graduated into a world in which it was, if it's stiff, then you wiggle it. If it's loose, then you try and stiffen it or tighten it or strengthen around it. If it's inflexible, you stretch it. If it's weak, you strengthen it. It's like there were these that sounds a bit harsh, but you did disembody people. You thought that your clinical tests and your special testing was more valid than it is, and you just kind of had this. Eventually, you'd understand you'd get to know a flowchart of clinical diagnostic and treatment options that would then help you to flow through them, and that your rapport was always seen as important, but the rapport was simply to try and motivate people to go through said flowchart sensibly. And we're maturing away from that massively, but it's like when we do so, if you don't then have a decent standard of practice that then is consistent, then you're going to get unwarranted variation. And the only upside of, say, flowchart thinking is that you can sort of not mandate it, but try to, it's almost like a really narrow logic model that people follow. So you can sort of, there's less unwarranted variation, but unfortunately, we're all wrong instead of just some of us. In that instance, we were kind of over medicalizing practice in many ways. And by that, I don't necessarily mean because we were sort of giving structural diagnoses or medical diagnoses. I'm just meaning that we were kind of as if, implying that our tests were as valid as, say, a blood pressure marker, and then that was going to indicate and titrate a dosage of say, Ramipril. Now, I'm well aware that even, that has been challenged, don't get me wrong, but I'm just meaning that was kind of what we were thinking, is that a series or even individual set of knee ligament tests were going to reveal a diagnostic category that the patient will be in, and therefore almost what rehab or what indication of what treatment or what mobilization or what grade might have had. And so it was like that sort of tempting model that we used to have meant that you would, if that was where the evidence had supported over the last couple of decades, then you would end up in this situation where you'd have less variation. So variation has come as a positive in many ways because there's so many more options, and we know that there's less hard and fast rules than we used to think. We've become less orthopedically minded, and that's good. But how do we get rid of the unwarranted, the unjustified, the things that we don't feel are appropriate bang for their buck under a public purse, especially the things that we would want to squeeze out into the fringes of the private sector? There's some, of course, that would have them banned. I've spoken on this show and beyond about the fact that I think, whilst it's not feasible, it also just doesn't suit my take on push them underground. You ban. Things aren't banned, right? You can get your horoscope at the Trafford Centre for more than you'd pay me as a clinician. That these things exist, but how do we make sure that they are not within mainstream or anywhere near credible medical practices and healthcare practices? That sort of thing I'm meaning. And so, I think that this is to be honest, I think it's the centre of the bullseye. I think hats off to Connect and the Change series for what they've been doing, but also for hosting this conversation amongst these particular people, because I think that that's exactly where it needs to be. It's all well and good having clinicians muse on this stuff, but you need people that are thoughtful about it to really poke into what the data is telling us about what the opportunities that knock, how much progress is being made, how do we go about trying to change things without coming across as heavy-handed so that clinicians don't feel like their practice is being outlawed and banned and they feel therefore got at. Like, how do we rationalize it and justify it, and where is the line? Fascinating. I love it. Absolutely love it. I'm gutted to have not been as involved in that side of the conversation where it meets policy as I used to be. In recent months, I haven't. I'll be back, as will many of my colleagues and our organisations. But when you see good things happening, I can do nothing but promote it. And so I hope you guys do sign up. So have a look at that again, 17th of November on the Wednesday. I'm just going to try to see if possible, in case, if anyone's listening that can help me with this, then please let me know. I wish I'd have teed up a link that I could just post in it, and I'm kicking myself now for having not done. I'm just going to try and find it, just a second. So that you guys that are tuning in can just have a little look at this and get signed up. Sign up here, right? Hopefully for you guys that are tuning in to the video and stuff, you'll be able to look in the comments section and get signed up on this. Hopefully this link works. I doubt is that going to work? Look at that terribly ugly link. So I'm sorry if it doesn't. but I'll find another one and I'll post it beyond. Or look on my social media, and I'm going to promote this on my social media in a little while. So do find me on there. So thank you so much, and sorry for those that have been commenting. I definitely have been ignoring you today. That was rude of me, wasn't it? I just needed to get that off my chest. Absolute favourite subject of mine, and so I've not chewed it over with you. And I'm also still having some problems, unfortunately, with some of the media that comes through. Like LinkedIn isn't showing me comments and stuff. I still get Facebook comments through, so thank you, Gemma, especially this compliment here. She said, looking sharp. My crew cut, you see, Mrs. Chu still doing the lockdown haircut, so I think she's in the frame for that now. Gemma's saying that variation in practice is what makes us great and not so great, depending on the therapist. Yeah, at what point in which do we vary, and how much can we vary for good and how much can we vary for ill? She's then said, great topic, on point, and where some are afraid to go or challenge their own comfort zone. I will be attending the event with interest. Yeah, thanks, Gemma. And Sarah said the same. Sarah, I can't pull your message up because it's coming through on Twitter. So yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's just the way that this system is working. I think that there's a few bugs that I'm and nothing that I can help with at the moment for bringing it in from other media. So Tune It Over streams to a few different channels, and for those of you that can participate, usually I bring them up on screen like I just did Gemma's comments. But yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, John, for your comments. I'm just not able to bring them up on screen, but essentially the ways in which we have this discussion is going to massively make a difference as to how mature the conversation is moving forward. And if you don't participate in that, or if you don't contribute, if you have strong opinions about how, if you don't get involved, there is a risk that some people in charge might be heavy-handed with the application of clinical guidance that doesn't then give you as much room as you would like to apply your clinical reasoning and person-centeredness to your practice. And especially if you don't have the freedom to practice under the governance of it, right? If it's not your business, or if you're working in the health service and certain styles of practice or styles of thinking have been outlawed, say, then you need to speak up. There's also the other side, is if you feel that things need tightening up so that your friends and colleagues can't necessarily do some of what you feel are unwarranted styles of practice, and you're not contributing to this conversation through this webinar and beyond, then again, I think you're going to miss out. And I think it'd be a shame. So whatever your opinion is, join the conversation. Thank you for Connect's leadership on this. And also, of course, that poster, once again, they are platforming some characters on here that are all doing their own brilliant work, and something that you should be paying attention to as well. So, it's really good that that's happening. Massively support it, and I'm glad I've been able to sort of chew it over for you all today. It's something that will come back around, and I'll chat about another time, and I'll definitely get you guys more involved in the conversation, especially once I sort out the sort of Q&A side function of our live streams. But yeah, always interested to hear your thoughts, especially because I'm not being able to platform them as easily as I used to. So do comment, and I'll make sure I follow all the feeds after the fact, or email info@physio-matters.com if you've got any strong opinions, especially if you disagree with me, because I'd love that. And if you want to come on the show and challenge me on all of my nonsense, then you can do that. Would be great as well. Always a pleasure. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Always do that, don't I? That's the wrong video. Thanks, everyone.